Hello, welcome to Gardener's World. These dahlias have been grown in this bed for cut flowers, and I have to say they've been really happy. What they love is open space, light, lots of nutrition, and then they grow really well. Now, I'm not a dahlia specialist. I just enjoy growing them as part of the mix of the garden. But in today's program, we are celebrating those men and women who focus their attention on just one group of plants, sometimes just on one plant or even one fruit. And it's a diverse mix, but the one common thread that runs through all of them is their deep passion for plants. Coming up on today's show, we meet somebody who has let absolutely nothing get in the way of growing his prize gooseberries.
To get a world record gooseberry, you've got to be dedicated, and it meant not going on holiday. We didn't go out at weekends.
They're his #1 priority. I've never liked them.
And we visit an enthusiastic gardener who has transformed his Clapham garden into a Caribbean paradise.
Almost every garden centre has what I call half off, half dead. Check the roots. If the roots are there, you'd be amazed what can be revived.
When you're deadheading dahlias, it can be a bit tricky to determine which is a bud that hasn't yet opened and which is one that is completely finished. But the rule is pretty infallible. A bud that is yet to open is always more or less round. If you hold it, it's really compact. But a flower that is spent and finished always are pointed and basically conical. And if you squeeze them, they're much softer than a bud. And that's why you deadhead, to delay the onset of seed so the energy goes into producing flower. The other thing is when you're deadheading, don't just cut off the spent flower head. Go right back down to the next side shoot, the next leaf, and cut just above it. That will stimulate a new side shoot, which in turn will carry a new flower. And that way, you keep your dahlias flowering right on into autumn. Now, I do this assiduously because I love dahlias. I want them to be part of the garden as long as possible. But for Arthur Parkinson, in his garden in Nottinghamshire, they are the main players.
I love pots because I don't have a choice, really. I wish there was a choice, but the lovely thing about a pot is you automatically have height. So that means a sunflower or dahlia is going to reach 10 foot. So you're very quickly growing a jungle which can properly engulf you. I'm Arthur Parkinson. I'm a florist and a writer, and I garden at home. I garden for colour and I garden for cut flowers, but not in a conventional way because we don't have any soil to dig into. Instead, it's all in containers.
The front yard is only about 3 metres square, but it gets the sun, so the dahlias like it.
When I'm in my garden, I want to feel like I'm at a festival, that I'm having a beautiful, flamboyant time. So for me, it's oranges, scarlets. I'm drawn to pink, but it has to always be a deep magenta pink. There was one year where I used a lot of pink cosmos, and it was just too blancmange and trifle-like for me. I spent some time training as a gardener. I spent around a year at Kew, which was an incredible year being immersed in palm fronds and bananas and that sort of other level of exotic planting. And I've taken that and I've inputted it in my own garden. I want to push the boundaries of what a container garden can be. It doesn't just have to be a hanging basket, which I can't stand at all. I'd much rather have a huge, monstrous pot like what you'd find at the entrance of somewhere like Kew, but by the door. The dolly tub was my mum's favourite possession, and I've inherited that from her. As well as dolly tubs, I use the old galvanised bins, the sort that a good strapping dustbin man would have had to put over his shoulder every morning. And they're fantastic, and actually they're a bit bigger than a dolly tub, so you can cram more into them. So a mixture of old, but always metal, never plastic. The typical dahlia is a very circus-like freak show at times. They combine colours, their shapes are very galaxy-like. The dahlias that my heart belongs to certainly are the single ones, which are like bright stars surrounding a very jammy middle of stamens and anthers. Their petals are velvet when they first open, and then they fade out a little bit, but they keep that beauty right until the last stage, really, and then they lose their petals and you're left with a horrible, wet little jellyfish thing that you have to deadhead straight away. Chickens were my first love. They're something that my brain had in it as soon as I had a mind of my own, and I find them hugely comforting. I treat them like they're dogs, really. Some are shy, some are quite bold, some are happy to be carried around like they're a chihuahua all day, and others don't want anything to do with you. So I've known a lot of chickens, and I'll always want them within a garden. I think they give huge animation and comfort to a space. It's quite hard keeping them in a town because of cats and dogs and foxes, but I get round that by having them in large aviaries in my nana's garden, and the hens come for a day out to do bug control and also to read round the bricks. The beaks are very good at keeping dandelions in check. We often go to flowers first, but what I've learnt is it does pay to look at foliage, even in an annual display first. So I'm growing much more grasses this year, so things like panicum, frosted explosion and red millet. Both of those grasses are very quick to grow from seed. They look beautiful, giving things a beautiful horizon above flowers or around flowers. And it's autumn now, so they're all starting to seed, and they're like having a living bird feeder within a pot. It's supposed to be for the blue tits. Watering every day when it's hot is pretty much vital, and when I say watering, I mean watering by buckets. And the reason I drench rather than sprinkle is because that water needs to go fully down into the base of that pot. It is a bit of a tie, but it is like, in a way, having an exotic garden, so it means I don't have to jet off to the Amazon or the Congo to feel like I'm in the jungle. I do have it by the door, so there's compensation. I do love to see a variety of pollinating insects in the garden, and this year that's one of the reasons I've chosen single dahlias as the staple flower. When we've had the warmer nights, I've been going out into the garden at about 9 o'clock. Often I do that to go on slug patrol, but as well as finding slugs, I've been finding sleeping bees who actually use the dahlias as a little bee hotel. So it's been wonderful finding a whole plant with a baby bee in it, asleep. And of course that bee can then wake up in the morning and have its breakfast straight away. The garden gets all the money that I have, without a doubt. I don't think anything wrong of spending £100 or so on tulip bulbs every year if it gives you that pleasure. So that means there's no designer wardrobe, but it does mean I have a designer tulip collection in the spring, and I know which I'd rather have. You forget yourself when you're in an exuberant garden, and it consumes you. It consumes you mentally, it consumes your time. It's about having a living thing that needs you, that is dependent on you, and that you have built, that you have put all your imagination into, and love and creation, and it just gives back time and time again, especially when you add cut flowers into the equation, because that means the garden can be taken into your home with you. It becomes a daily aspect of your interior as well as your exterior.
I do like Arthur's point that a garden is a portrait of your interior as much as exterior. And clearly those rich, strong colours run very deep. Come on, Patty. Now, the pond here doesn't seem to be minding this heat wave and an incredible dryness that we've been having. And this is such an important resource for every living creature that we share the garden with. But over the last week, all the marginal plants, these are the ones not in the water at all, have really dried up. And what I should have done is created a bog system, a kind of overflow from the pond, so I'd have permanently damp soil. Maybe that's a project that I will tackle next year. But for our next visit, there was no problem whatsoever in finding damp, boggy areas of the garden to plant in.
I think I like moisture-loving plants because they're different to the plants that love dry and arid conditions. And I think plants are really, really clever. My name is Liz Webster and I've been running my nursery here in Fishlake since 2010. My previous career was in the health service. I was a practice manager in general practice, which involved a lot of sitting behind a desk and dressing up in smart clothes. Since I've been running the nursery, I have wet hair frequently, dirty clothes, and I don't sit behind a desk very often. So much improved from my point of view. When we moved here, we discovered, because we're quite remote and rural, that we had no mains drainage. So our effluent system passes through 3 separate tanks and ends up in an area of the garden, which we discovered was rather wet when we got here. There's a tank in that corner, so by the time the effluent reaches there, everything's solid, settled out. And so you've basically got the clean water coming out into this area. So it is literally a bog garden. So rather than just leaving it and wondering what to do with it, this was the beginning of a sort of interest in bog garden plants, because we then started investigating the sort of plants that would be suitable to plant in these conditions. So it's turned into quite a success as that. I love this plant. This is Gunnera manicata. It's quite typical of a bog garden plant. This one's a little bit small at the moment, but it's a bit early in the season. By the end of June, the leaves will be enormous and it'll be reaching up to this tree. And it's almost prehistoric when you look at the detail of it. You can see the new leaves that are emerging down here. Quite spiky, actually. It is hardy down to about -10, but you can use the old leaves to cover the crown in winter and give it that little bit of protection. We started looking at plants that were suitable for bog gardens, and then also started adding in other plants that we knew liked moisture retentive conditions. Some failed, but then others have thrived, some that might be surprising. This plant some people might not be familiar with. It's a trollius, Trollius alabaster. Lovely at this time of the year, lovely creamy yellow buttercup-like flowers. Not a very big plant, only grows to about 2 feet tall. So it's good at the front of a border, and it's quite happy in this wet soil. Very pretty plant, nice and compact, doesn't spread and run all over the place. People think that grasses are only really for hot, sunny, dry places, but in actual fact this is a sedge rather than a grass, and it much prefers a lot of moisture at its roots. They're a fantastic colour, and if you keep them in a shaded position, they'll keep this lovely, fresh, bright green foliage. And then you also get the bonus at this time of year, these little tiny feathery flowers. They're an absolute lovely, lovely little plant, are those. I think one of the things I like about moisture-loving plants is quite a lot of them are quite architectural. They've got huge leaves. You don't have to have flowers to have interest in a garden.
There are times here in winter when I'm splashing around in the mud, when I feel that Longmeadow must be one of the wettest gardens possible. But having seen Liz's setup, I realise that we are comparatively dry. That is one of the wettest gardens I have ever seen, and clearly she loves it. Now, going from wet plants to the completely the other extreme, to succulents. And this is a bulb that I planted up earlier this year, And not only is it still looking good, I'm very happy with it, but they're thriving. I haven't watered them, I have done nothing to them at all. The only water they've had is a bit of rain, and recently not a lot of that. The way succulents work is they draw up water from their roots and store it in their foliage. So they've got their own reserve. It is important you give them the right compost. They need a really gritty, free-draining compost, and they do need plenty of sunshine. But if you can give them that, certainly any rain we get is more than enough for them. So of a plant that you can grow on windowsills and balconies, I suspect there are none that are less demanding. We now visit Terry Smale, who has developed a passion for one particular group of succulent plants. And to my mind, these are amongst the strangest living things that you will find on this planet.
The Mesembryanthemum family is essentially southern African. There's a total of about 1,700 species, but the ones which really interest the enthusiasts like me are lithops and conophyton. Just so totally unique. They're weird plants, there's nothing else quite like them, and they're actually beautifully adapted to the environments in which they grow. I started really growing plants when I was very young. My parents had a little two-bedroom terraced house in Plymouth. My father made his own little greenhouse in this tiny back garden, but as a child I was allowed to sow things in there. But I do have a memory about my father taking me to a cactus and succulent show at the local Quaker meeting house. And I do actually remember seeing lithops. It was the first time that I've ever seen anything like lithops. It really went on from there. The name lithops comes from the Greek lithos, which means stone. And because they have this stone-like appearance, the common name that's normally used for them is living stones. Most of it is below ground, and very often all you've got above ground is the flat top surface. And when you look carefully at a lithops plant, you will see that there are transparent areas, and these regulate the amount of light which can get down inside the body and which can be used for photosynthesis. The best time to repot any succulent plants is early in their growing season. So for lithops, May, June, maybe July is the ideal time. The potting mix that I use for all of my mesembryanthemums is equal parts of John Innes number 3 and this very coarse granite grit, which is round about 4 millimetres particle size. And we can just sort of mix that up. And then that is my standard mix, which is very well drained. We can easily separate them out. We've got a nice deep taproot on it and give it plenty of room. So just a bit of compost in there, let the roots drop down, and just gently firm it. And I always keep little brushes handy so you can just dust off the plants afterwards. My favourite genus, Conophyton, is a lot less well known than lithops. What particularly appeals to me is the sheer variety that you get in this genus. So, for instance, the contrast in size and shape. So if you look at this one, we've got a plant which is maybe 4 centimetres tall and very sort of deeply lobed, and then contrast it with this very tiny plant. These plants are actually 25 years old, and yet we've got these very small heads which are only a few millimetres across. To get seed from lithops or conophytums, you need two different clones, which are not genetically identical. The stamens and stigma are hidden right down in a narrow flower tube. So you need something that's very thin to transfer the pollen from one to another. The way I do it is to use one of my own hairs that I can pull out with the sticky follicle end still intact. And that can be inserted into the flower tube to pick up the pollen, which can then be transferred. And in doing this, I'm effectively mimicking the small insects, small bees, etc., which would do this in the wild. After you've pollinated lithops or conophytum plants, the seed pods develop over the winter, but by the time they get to next summer, they dry up to form these woody capsules. When it rains, the seed pods open up and the seeds are released. And I really must show you this particular plant, which is actually called Conophytum smaelorum. And this was named for me and for my wife Jennifer, really to recognise the amount of work that we've done over the years in distributing seeds of all of the Mesembryanthemum family. So we're really rather proud to have that. My passion for these plants is, it started 50 years ago. I will have these plants, and particularly the conophytums, with me till the end of my life. I'm absolutely sure of that.
I have to say that it's just as well as Terry has such a fine head of hair. Otherwise, his propagation methods might have to be altered somewhat. The summer raspberries are now completely coming to an end. These, the summer ones, I've got the old stems there, which have the fruit on, and then the new ones ready to be pruned in for next year. So I take away all the old stems, tie in the new, and they will give me next year's fruit. But at the same time, autumn raspberries kick in at the end of August and are at their best in September and October, and if it's a mild autumn, into November as well. And they're very easy to grow because you don't have to worry about the complexities of pruning. They produce their fruit on new growth, so when they finish fruiting and all the leaves have fallen, which will be by the new year, just cut everything to the ground. And the new growth that will come back in spring will give you fruit at the end of summer. And for me, fresh raspberries from the garden are amongst the best fruit you could possibly eat. But we went to visit Kelvin Archer, who grows his gooseberries with a passion. And for him, flavour comes very low on the list of priorities because it is all about size and weight.
I got into gardening as a young boy through my dad, really, because my dad was a farm worker and he was keen on growing vegetables in our country garden. We used to water and help him sow the seeds and pick the vegetables, and then we used to take them to local shows and show the vegetables. So I got into it from an early age, really. Right, OK, Dad, if we roll this net back. My real passion in gardening is growing gooseberries. The reason I started growing gooseberries was because it was a village tradition and all the local villagers showed their gooseberries once a year at the annual gooseberry show, and I just thought it was fascinating, so I tagged along and did the same thing. I'll pick all these off this side first and then I'll come round that side in a minute. Just have a look at that one, there's nothing wrong with that one, no, it's not burst or anything, is it?
No, it's all right.
All right. Grow gooseberries simply to try and get the heaviest gooseberry in the world. My biggest achievement was to achieve the world record, which I got in 2013, and it was compared with a large hen's egg. I've got a rough idea in your head that that gooseberry is bigger than anything that you've ever grown before, but until that goes on the scales, you've no idea if it's going to beat that world record. But when it actually tips the weights and it starts balancing, then you know you've got that world record, and then you think, yeah, well done.
41 pennyweights, 11 grains, a new world record.
I was absolutely overwhelmed because I thought that record would never get beaten again. It's just really amazing. To get a world record gooseberry, you've got to be dedicated. And before I got it, I was obsessed, and it meant not going on holiday. We didn't go out at weekends, or if it rained, we couldn't go out because of covering the gooseberries, so we never went anywhere.
They're his #1 priority. We've even had to miss school sports day so that he could be at home to cover and uncover the gooseberries. I hate them. I've never liked them.
There you go.
Yeah, that's all right.
Nice, aren't they? Just feel how ripe that is, though. Just feel how soft it is. See how...
Very.
So tomorrow will be show day, so we all harvest them all tonight, which is called the Getter's Night. And the getter is someone who's selected from your show to come and watch you pick your gooseberries, and then you've got to go and watch him pick his gooseberries, so they're called getters. And what the getter does, he has to make sure that you pick that gooseberry off that tree, and you're not picking one up off the floor, which you could have had from anywhere else. Which you think is going to be the heaviest one?
Not one.
Oh, you're right, Dad. Right, Dad, so we'll put this one in first. And then your getter then watches you put the gooseberries in the box. He then seals it with sealing wax and string. And then I go round to my dad's and we'll do the same with his gooseberries. My getter is my dad, but there's no cheating involved there because we're both the fiercest rivals, and some year I'll come first and my dad will come last, so people know there's no cheating involved in that. Gooseberry growing for shows has been going for hundreds of years. It first started in the early 1800s, and in those days there were hundreds of shows all over the country. But now it's dwindled down to just 8 shows in Cheshire and 1 show in Yorkshire. The perfect gooseberry is a gooseberry that's as big as you can possibly get it without it bursting, because you're not allowed to show a gooseberry that's bursted, but they can be any shape whatsoever, because some of the gooseberries are long, some of them are round, they're oval, they're all different shapes. So it doesn't matter about the looks of them, it's just purely for the weight. The first thing that we do is start weighing the twins. Then we get on to the main prize, which is the Premier Berry. The person that won the show last year has to send his gooseberry onto the scales first, and then it's up for everybody else then to see if they can beat him. And whoever knocks him off, then they're up there to be fired at again by somebody else. And we just keep going through until we find out who's this year's champion. The gooseberry growers, I'll tell you all sorts of stories of the things that they feed the gooseberries on, and I don't really believe any of it. Some of them say that they give them Guinness and beer and put jam around them and sugar. I've never tried anything like that. Oh, no, I wouldn't be secret over something like this. No.
Hiding something?
No, I'm not hiding anything. So when the boxes were open today, I could see that last year's champion, John Porter's berry came out of the box, which looked a really good berry. I get excited, but more nervous than excited. It's like a nervous tension.
Kelvin's on.
You're always apprehensive in case somebody has got one, you know, a lot bigger than yours. Everybody says they've got no gooseberries, and all of a sudden you see a great big massive whopping gooseberry across there.
Winner, Kelvin Archer, 29 pennyweights dead.
Absolutely brilliant because of all the hard work that I put into them this year. It's like a year's work, so I'm delighted. There's always next year, and that's what we all aim to do, to try and beat the world record next year.
I could watch that film every day and I'd still love it. I love gooseberries too. I couldn't care how big or small they are. I just love the taste of them. Now here in the Jewel Garden, it's at its most vibrant at this time of year. It's a big dramatic display of colour. This is really the most personal and private part of the garden because it's all based on past experience. And that sense of meaning and personal, private importance is absolutely at the heart of our next visit to a garden in Clapham, in central London.
I'm Wayne Emile, and although we're in the centre of London, with its city noises all around us, I find I can completely lose myself in this garden. And I call this garden Clapham meets Jamaica because I'm from Jamaica, so it's a fusion of the different elements of my life. It's not an exotic garden because I love traditional English cottage plants as well. So the two are cheek by jowl. I somewhat tongue-in-cheek refer to this garden as a Jamaican no-taste garden. Not for 1 second am I saying Jamaicans don't have any taste. What I mean by that is I'm against anything that's fashionable. It has blousy flowers, it has plants that clash next to each other, and that's one of the reasons I grow so many things in pots. I can purposely put them to clash. It's the colour of the Caribbean, as many colours as I can get into a small space. I call this my theatre of plants. It's the only part of the garden you can see from the house because the garden is on a different level. And it's the view I get every morning when I have my tea before I face the world. And the advantage of having things in pots is when the plants are at their best, they come to the theatre here, and then I can move them to other parts of the garden. It allows you to grow things that normally wouldn't grow together. For example, the anthuriums along with dahlias, along with house plants. The inspiration of this garden really is from my childhood. Things that remind me of growing up in the Caribbean. I have a picture of me as a child, and my parents tell me that the only way they could get me to smile was to put a flower in my hand. And I think that's where my love of gardening started. I also have another picture of the view from the back of my mother's house, a banana wharf, as she called it. And I wanted to be able to look out of my window and see a similar view. This is another section of the garden that I've created in the tradition of a veranda. And verandas in Caribbean cultures are very important. They're the place where you sit at the end of the day and have a gin and tonic or a rum punch, and you gossip. My mother used to call it chat people's business, and it's where people like to be seen. So if you have the vicar coming for tea, that's the ultimate. You've made it. And it's surrounded by the different bananas, the tree ferns, the gunneras, the hostas. I haven't tried to replicate a Caribbean garden because it'd be impossible. So what I go for is what I call fakery. I grow anything with big leaves that they looks like it could come from the Caribbean. When I started this garden, there was absolutely no budget. So it's really to reuse as much as possible. I knew I wanted containers, so I started to look in skips as I'm out and about, and I was astonished to find people put plants in there as well. I found a tree fern, which are very expensive, just abandoned, and I brought it back to life, and it takes pride of place on the steps. This section is where the garden really opens up. And I love the different heights and the fact that there's trees. You have so much privacy for London. There's not much depth in terms of the soil towards the back of the garden. It means that things won't get too big. But I do think it's important, even in a small garden, to have different heights. I don't see the fact that this garden is north-facing as a problem, it's a challenge. Yes, there's areas where it's very shady, doesn't get much sun, but I totally disregard any of the guide and the rule books. If it says it needs sun, I'll still give it a try, but my cut-off point is 4 years. If after 4 years it's not doing something I like, then I do give it away, but I never throw a plant away. My top tip in terms of doing a garden on a budget is almost every garden centre superstore has what I call half off, half dead. Check the roots. If the roots are there, you'd be amazed what can be revived. And they're the plants I often go for, partly because I can't bear waste. What I'm doing here is demonstrating how to rescue a plant that perhaps has been forgotten because I have so many pots, or you've been on holiday and the person you entrusted has let you down. I dunk the plant into a bucket of water and really push it in, and the bubbles you can hear means that it's the air's escaping. And I leave it there until the bubbles have stopped. And then once the bubbles stop, then you know it's had a good drink. And this really helps with the plant's recovery. And it's simply a case of taking it out and keeping an eye on it and giving it lots of love. I'm not one of those people obsessed with tidying their garden, particularly as the season goes on and you get into autumn and winter. I leave plants. Not only is it good for wildlife, quite often, particularly with annuals, because in a city you have microclimates, that some annuals will come back. And think, wow, it's flowering again. Like all gardeners, I wage war against slugs and snails, and I sort of see it as you win some battles, but you use as much armour as you can. So the first thing I would do to protect the plants from slugs and snails is petroleum jelly, which if they're in a pot, I rub it around the edge of the rim of the pot. Then the next thing I would do is to use coffee granules, which I get from my local coffee shop, because the coffee granules, apparently the slugs and the snails don't like the texture of them. And then the final thing I do is I spray it with garlic spray. It's really important to spray underneath the plants because that's where slugs and snails come. And hopefully we should win at least one battle. To be resumed. The feeling I get when I come into this garden, it's just one of I'm able to float away and all the woes of the world just seem to disappear. But I recognise it's not everyone's cup of tea. It's not tasteful, but I don't want a tasteful garden. It's me.
I really enjoyed Waden's garden because it is quirky and individual. And by and large, I think the more that a garden reflects the gardener's personality, the better it is. I'm not actually picking sweet peas, I'm cutting off the seed pods in the slightly vain hope that that will trigger the production of more flowers. But we are coming to the end of the sweet pea season. Sweet peas are long day plants, so they do most of their flower production before the end of June, when we reach midsummer. Then as the days get shorter, the inclination to produce seed becomes overwhelming for them. And particularly after a hot, dry spell like we've had, that is definitely going to do it. Sweet peas do best in relatively cool, relatively moist conditions. They have a charm that is completely captivating. And of course, the fragrance is one of the very best of all. But we joined Tom Atherton as he was preparing for the Malvern show at the other end of the sweet pea season in spring. And I think it's fair to say that Tom's relationship with sweet peas is somewhat complicated.
There's no question about it. I like sweet peas, but I wouldn't say I love sweet peas. I wasn't going to be a gardener. The father rented a large allotment from the local farm, and By that time I was 7 years old, the eldest of 3 children, and big enough to move a barrow and big enough to handle garden tools, so it was my job to assist in this. And I can't truthfully say I liked it because my mates in the street didn't have the same privileges as having an allotment, and therefore they got more time to play. So I swore I would never have a garden. In this property that we're in now, we moved in 1966, and my father came along and said, "Why don't you grow some sweet peas?" he said. This was the fatal words, of course. He said, "I'll sow you some seeds." He said, "You prepare that trench." Anyway, they started to flower. Well, I was cutting probably 10,000 flowers a week, but I wasn't going to be a gardener. I was never going to be a gardener. I would suffer this, but that would be it, you see. I thought next year I could enter a flower show. In the middle of town, a banner appeared. The local show rules said you could enter up to 9 o'clock on the morning of the show. There was only 3 entries in the class, so because there were only 3 entries, I could get a prize, because you never know, some of the others might even get disqualified, and I could see they were better than mine. Anyway, the prizes had been awarded, first, second, and mine. Not even a third prize out of 3. And I looked in the mirror and I said, "Tom, if you're not good enough to get 3rd out of 3, you need to do something. Either forget it altogether or do something about it." So I went to the library and I borrowed a book on sweet peas. I became really hooked. I grow 1,300 cordon plants, essentially for personal exhibition, but I do grow them in next door's garden as a kind of overspell.
He just popped around one day and went, "You're not using the bottom of your garden, can I just borrow it?"
I've got some in the local park planted by some of the local children. Also, I've got some planted in the local hospital.
It's the Chorley Mafia for sweet peas.
I never planned it to be that way, and I never said I'm going to do this. It just evolved. I have no passion for the flower. To me, it is a means to an end of occupying time and interest and socialising with other people. The sweet pea is the catalyst that allows all this to happen. I don't have anxieties about Malvern, just terror, because obviously it's not the sweet pea season. And to do something out of season is a lot of special preparation. In the fridge, we've got 3 plants at this moment. 2 rather straddly ones that we might get a few cut flowers off to put in a vase, and another one that's been in now for nearly 4 weeks, which we've christened Nell after Eskimo Nell, because it's spent most of the 4 weeks in the fridge. It gets an airing for an hour or 2. I'm not sure that she's going to make it, because it's still a week off the shore or so at the moment, so we are hoping. This year, the season appears to be a little earlier. It is a little bit a wing and a prayer. We will, I'm sure, have a stand together. Unfortunately, I do realise I'm not a young person and I do have certain infirmities. Well, I would like to think I can keep on growing something, if it's only some of the dwarf ones and some of the species. I don't know whether that's a retirement from sweet peas or burial to put under the sweet peas to get plenty body in the ground, but I've bequeathed my ashes already to them, you see, because it's good for them, you know.
Well, Tom won a gold medal for his sweet peas at Morven. And in honour of his 80th birthday, he's had a sweet pea named after him, and I'm sure we'll all grow it in our gardens and love it. And who knows, perhaps Tom himself might learn to love it as well. Now, when I visited Morven Show back in 2014, I was captivated by the streptocarpus. I'd never grown them before. In fact, I associated them with my granny and rather boring sort of houseplants. Houseplants weren't trendy back then, but there were these delicate plants looking gorgeous, so I bought some. And these are largely the same plants and ones that I've propagated from them. But I had quite a lot of trouble in making them happy. Initially, they were fine, but it was either too bright, too hot, too wet, too dry. So in the end, I got them all and I stuffed them in the corner here over one winter, and I thought, fine, you're out the way, you can just look after yourselves. I'm done with you. I've given you my all. And they responded by growing magnificently. This is absolutely where they're happy. It's quite shady, but there's lots of light around. I don't water them very much, but they get the water dripping down from plants on the staging, and I do miss them, particularly in winter. But these flower for months and months on end. And sometimes accidents can get you where you want to be, but I guess that's no good for our specialist growers. They put in an enormous amount of time and effort to master their subject. And this expertise, in the case of Sally Williams in Derbyshire, has been directed towards her passionate love for peperomia.
Peperomia are a very large genus. There's over 1,500 different species, but there's over 3,000 different names. Because when the explorers were going out and finding these plants, they'd give it a name, and then somebody else would go out into a different country, find the same plant and give it another name. So there's a lot of confusion, a lot of duplication of the names. Peperomia have adapted to grow in some very different conditions. Because of that, they've developed very different leaf shapes and sizes and colours in order to cope with different conditions that they're growing in. In the UK, we grow them as houseplants, and they're very happy growing in houses. They like the conditions that are comfortable for us. This is the room where I keep most of my plants in. I have got them dotted in different places around the house, arranged so that they look nice with contrast between the different leaf shape and size and different colours. But in this room, they're pretty much organised by species. At this end, I've got the ones with lower light requirements, and at this end, I've got the ones that really like intense light. A lot of these are the high-altitude ones that like living really high up in the tropics. You can imagine they get a lot of sunshine. In this room, because there's lots of plants together, it tends to get just naturally high humidity, just the plants on their own. So I don't really need to do anything to increase the humidity to give them the sort of humidity levels that they'd be happy with. They do it themselves. So that's one way in your home. If you've got central heating, it can make the atmosphere in the house really dry, which can be uncomfortable for people. Whereas if you have plants grouped, even 5 plants in a room will substantially increase the humidity levels and make it much more comfortable to live in. I bought my first peperomia as a child. I was about 12 years old, and the shape and size of the plant and its leaves really appealed to me. The one that I first bought was this type. It was a Peperomia caparata. I really liked the crinkly leaves and the long rat tail inflorescences. I thought that was quite quirky. To propagate peperomia is really straightforward. All you need to do is break off a leaf and pop it into some water, and then within a few weeks, you're going to get some roots. But my latest method that I like is I actually use just old hummus pots, and I pop the leaves in there. And this one was put in less than a month ago, and I've already got a lovely little plant growing which has got its roots and it's got its leaves, and that can go straight into potting medium. So that's how you propagate your peperomia once you've got them. But to start off, if you go to a garden centre and you find a peperomia, I think it's really important to, one of the first things you do is tip it out and have a look at the growing medium that it's in. Because very often they're planted just in pure compost. And that'll be all right for the first few weeks of its life, but very quickly the compost gets compacted and the roots don't have the aeration, they can't breathe like they need to do. So this one's not so bad. There is some perlite in there, but I immediately, as soon as I get a new plant, I pot it onto my own potting compost mix. And to do that, I use 2 parts of a peat-free compost, 1 part of perlite, and a part of orchid bark. but generally that will keep all peperomia pretty happy.
Obviously, Sally has hundreds of plants at her home, but the great thing about peperomia is they so match the current demand for houseplants. And there'll be a peperonia that will grow in full sun, in shade, in high humidity. If it's a bit drier, a really useful plant. These roses are starting to put on a really good second performance. They never stop flowering, but they have a little bit of a quiet period in July and early August. These were the first 3 English roses I ever planted about 7 years ago. There's Charles Darwin, which starts out a slightly egg yolky yellow and then fades to pale, almost white. There's the Pilgrim, which has got a yellow center and gets whiter as it goes to the outside of the mass of petals. And finally, we have Crown Princess Margareta, which is a beautiful apricot. An apricot's such a difficult color to get in flowers. And if you just keep deadheading them, they will go on flowering and flowering. And it's lovely to have roses at this time of year. But for our next visit, we go to somebody who roses are more than just something she loves. And it's not so much as a botanical passion as something that is deeply embedded into her sense of health.
I find the best medicine for me is literally just putting my boots on, stepping outside, breathing in the fresh air, getting stuck into my gardening. It really does soothe the soul. My name's Michelle Thomas, and I love roses, I love gardening, and I now have approximately 230 roses in my garden. I adore them for the smell, the colour, the shapes of some of them, especially the single roses, and I love cutting them, bringing them into the house, so then you've got the scent around you in the house. I love everything about roses, really. I first noticed I was struggling with mental health problems, probably when I was round about an 11 and away at school. I knew I got very, very homesick. I knew I didn't like school, but I did think that everybody felt the way I felt, where you had these absolutely immensely dark days. But I carried on. I worked in London, number of different jobs. I got married. I had my daughter Rhea. And then when Rhea was 2, I went on and had my son Miles. But sadly, when he was just a few weeks old, he died. That obviously knocked me for 6. But I carried on. I ended up having my 3 sons, Tom, Ollie and Barney. But I still had these desperately dark days and had no idea really what was happening. I still just believed that it was how everybody felt. I mean, everybody gets bad days. And it was only through having to see my doctor really quite a lot with not feeling I was coping did we discover that there was actually something wrong with me and I was suffering from a type of bipolar, along with also PTSD. About 27 years ago, my daughter bought me a tiny little rose. But this rose was in a little plastic pot and I kept it in the kitchen. I didn't know back then that you needed to plant roses out in the garden. I kept it inside, its leaves fell off, it looked seriously ill. So then I did eventually bring it outside. I had no borders, nothing, just an expanse of lawn. So I dug a hole and plonked it in. 27 years later, it's still here. We've had our moments when it hasn't looked too great, but I've learnt to prune them, feed them, and it's actually now doing very well. And then the other little ones that I have down here are all from my boys. I added these ones, which I allowed to go much higher, so you kind of get this different shape in the border. But that was the beginning of my garden, and this was it. But I didn't see the connection back then that doing all of this was actually helping me feel better. This is one of my favourite spots in the garden. I absolutely love sitting here, especially in the evenings, and the sun's going down, but it throws this light out on the flowers in front of me, and the smell is absolutely beautiful. It is so peaceful as it starts to turn dark. It really is a lovely spot to sit. I think my roses have probably done so well because I do care for them. I do my very best to look after them, and in a sense that makes me feel they must care about me too. 2 years ago, when all my children had left home, I decided I really wanted to do something with the garden, and that's when I discovered the NGS, National Garden Scheme. So I now open to the public. And I think through doing that, it makes me have to garden all the time. You know, you want it looking nice. When I'm mentally not feeling good, I still have to go outside to garden. So in a way, it's almost been the cure. I finally realised after all these years that if I'm gardening, I'm going to be okay. I feel safe, happy, and it works.
I'm so glad that Michelle has found something that helps her with her own health and steers her through difficult times. And actually in that process, you can see has developed a real love and feeling and knowledge, an emotional knowledge for roses. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's celebration of all the wonderful plants, men and women who have thrown so much passion and knowledge and energy into pursuing their love of particular plants. And we all benefit from that. All our gardens can feed off that knowledge and learning and make ourselves and our gardens just that little bit better. I'm going to be away next week, so you'll be with Adam in his garden, but I'll be back here at Longmeadow in a couple of weeks' time. So until then, bye-bye.